You are good to go.
Great. Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to our session, the post-US presidential election, economy, legal and tax 101. We will start off with just a few ground rules before we dive into the session. So we want to make sure our microphones are muted when we're not speaking, so as to filter out any background noise. Any questions that the attendees and the audience has, we'll address in the last 10 minutes of the session, or when we come to an end of the Q&A with our panelists. And this is a safe space for everyone, so we do ask that you respect this safe space. Anyone that is being disrespectful or rude, we will have to remove from the session. And so everybody is aware, all of the sessions are being recorded. And I do encourage you to pin the moderator and the panelists, so myself and the panelists, to the screen so you can see who's talking. But now those ground rules are out the way, I'd love to welcome you all to our session. So once again, it's the post-US presidential election, economy, tax and legal 101. My name is Puja Singh and I'm the moderator today. A big thank you to our sponsors, Coca-Cola and Bank of America. And also to our panelists. We have Tom Gaynor, corporate partner at DLA Piper, Michael Duffy, wealth strategist at Merrill Lynch, and Jim Glassman, managing director at JPMorgan. So chaps, if you'd like to introduce yourselves, let's start off with Tom, and then we'll go round Jim and then Mike, and then we'll dive into some questions after your introductions.
Thank you, Puja, and thank you so much for organizing the panel, and thank you to the sponsors that have made the opportunity available to everybody. My name is Tom Gaynor. I'm a corporate and M&A partner at DLA Piper. I work on large strategic clients that typically are based outside of the United States with large US presences, and am delighted to be here with my fellow panelists. So thanks again for making today available.
Thank you, Puja. I'm Jim Glassman. I'm an economist, cover our commercial bank client base, and I travel around a lot and I talk to people. We're really just we're trying to solve a puzzle, trying to help people understand what we know, what we don't know, how things may be playing out here that are different. And I probably learn more from my clients than they learn from me. But I cover the economic ground, and it's a fascinating time.
And my name is Michael Duffy. Thank you again for hosting this and inviting everybody on the line to speak. I'm a managing director for Merrill Lynch Private Wealth. The group that I'm in is designed to really help guide ultra high net worth clients through the labyrinth of various tax and security law issues that come up in their very busy balance sheets. And for the last 4 or 5 months, my time has been spent predominantly helping clients do kind of pre-Biden planning, which we'll discuss in a little bit, but will be important if the 2 Senate seats in Georgia turn blue on January 5th. So, thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, we will be going into that early on the agenda, actually. But first off, I'm sure you can all agree that this year has been absolutely phenomenal. It's been quite something. And as entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs are acclimatizing to an upcoming new administration, there are going to be challenges facing them. So amidst our current political noise, there are questions around scaling up businesses, scaling back, strategizing, and what changes to anticipate. So diving into the questions, Jim, let's talk about those 2 Georgia Senate seats. Will the outcome of these make a difference for the Washington's agenda in the next 2 years? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. It must go on automatically. Yeah. Long story short, I honestly don't think it does make a difference on the surface, but the fact is we've got a Senate that's very divided, and I think what we've already learned. I mean, for a while, Congress has been somewhat divided, and we've learned that even the Republicans were not able to overturn the Affordable Care Act with one vote dissenting. And I think it's a reminder. I really think that whether the outcome of the Georgia races flips controls of Democrats or Republicans, when you have such a divided House, it's hard to push through dramatic changes in policy. And I think what it does do is it increases the leverage of the guys toward the center. Because whether if the Republicans are in control, a more moderate Democrat could easily flip and support something on the Republican side, and the other way around. It's a lot easier for someone in the middle. I think it gives them a bigger voice, and they have more leverage by being able to cross lines for things that matter. So I suspect, honestly, I think it does matter, but not in a substantive way. And I honestly think that for the next year or so, Washington's agenda is going to be so focused on trying to repair the remaining damage, get us through this COVID crisis, that's going to dominate the agenda, is my guess.
Absolutely. And Michael, I see you nodding your head. I know you've got something to add to this. So what are your views?
Well, tax legislation is a little bit different animal because there is a possibility that you can pass tax legislation a few different ways, assuming that the Senate wins. So for everybody on the line, right now, if the 2 seats in the Senate in Georgia go blue, and then with Kamala Harris's vote, they have a so-called majority in the Senate. And presumably that would pave the way for some of the Biden recommendations to go through. But historically, laws need 60 votes, and so 51 doesn't really cut it. So they can do a couple things. One is the nuclear option that everybody doesn't want to touch, which is they could just do away with the filibuster rule, which would allow laws to eventually pass at 51%. They could do, there could be some moderates that come over, and so they do get their 60% vote, depending upon what the legislation is. And again, it couldn't be too dramatic. Otherwise, it's a no-go. But finally, they could jam it down our throats just through a Budget Reconciliation Act. So that only takes 51 votes. And that's been used often in the past. I mean, that's how the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 was passed, was through budget reconciliation. Interestingly, the 2017 Tax Act, for everybody on the line, most of the provisions of that Tax Act, as they relate to individuals, expire by law on December 31st, 2025. So in 2026, we roll back to whatever the tax rates and rules were for individuals beginning 2017. I do think I don't think anything substantial is going to come out if we don't win both seats. If we win both seats, I do expect there to be tax legislation under the guise of budget reconciliation.
Right. And Tom, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, it's kind of funny that we're sitting talking about the post-presidential election, and the domination of that conversation is really the Senate. And it's one of the things that's ironic coming out of 2020 is we're all getting a very good lesson in civics, much like we did in 2016 about the importance of the Electoral College and how the elections truly are won. And what's the primer, I think, coming out of 2020 is the primer on the division of power and how the process and the system is truly designed to diffuse power. Mm-hmm. And my 2 co-panelists were talking about a bit of a stasis regardless of the outcome. And I'm going to predict, much like I did on a panel in 2016, I predicted Trump was going to win, and I was laughed out of a room in Boston. But I'm going to predict that it's going to be a split decision, that the Reds are going to pick up one and the Blues are going to pick up one. And that's going to remain a Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden challenge and opportunity. Mm-hmm. Because as the previous panelists were talking about, it's the centrists that I think are going to be the ascendancy. Because if you think about it, we immediately are starting to think about the next cycle. And in 2022, everybody is going to be thinking about two different things, 1994 and 2010. And there was a slaughter in both of those years in the first midterm of a new president, which means that we're going to have, I think, a momentum for a centrist policy that comes out of this election. In some ways to address the COVID issue, because I think that, as Jim said, I think that's going to dominate all the policy discussions for the first 6 months of the administration, which is usually when they have the most opportunity for their firepower. And I think to some degree, his attention is going to have to be focused on that primarily, which is going to distract from some of the longer term ambitions that I think he may have that may get watered down if he's got a split government. And if he's got a split government, that means Senator Collins from Maine is going to be incredibly influential. You have a much more consolidated majority in the House of Representatives. 4 seats means Speaker McCarthy in 2022. And that means everybody in the majority knows that. So I think they're going to be loath to do something radical. And that probably will mean that the markets will like the situation of sort of a counterbalance equilibrium, which means that you may not have radical policy one way. You may have a bit of a Goldilocks economic opportunity for entrepreneurs, for entrepreneurial funding, and for other sorts of business combinations and business finance opportunities. So ironically, the government somewhat being handcuffed could present an enormous economic opportunity in the next 24 months.
Right. And which areas do you think?
I think our founding fathers would be thrilled by this discussion, by the way. This is exactly what they hoped to invent. If the country's divided, and if we're not divided, then things happen. But if they're not, we get centrist things out of these kinds of situations.
Right. I think we're all on board with that, totally. And what areas do you think will benefit the most, like given these outcomes, Tom? You've touched upon a few, but what areas do you feel will benefit the most?
So, I think you're going to see an awful lot of interest, primarily in real estate. Real estate is going to be, it's the unspoken crisis on the horizon. Commercial real estate in the major cities and the impact and the ramifications of COVID, I think that's the package that they've got to be thinking about right out of the get-go in January, to be addressing an implosion that's a ticking time bomb. And with a much more centrist focus, policy agenda driven opportunity for negotiation and for a better outcome as soon as the new Congress convenes. When you see funding that's going to be available, I think you're going to see an awful lot of R&D and technology-focused opportunity. You may see a whole host of new opportunities and tax credits and a reinvigorated new technologies and green technologies, investment opportunity and investment structure. You'll probably see some focus on infrastructure and manufacturing. I think there's a unique opportunity post-COVID, or in the tail end of the COVID discussions, to focus on that which is going to be made in the U.S. And ironically, a lot of that goes from the China war of the last 4 years. I think you'll see a much more lower temperature on the international trade front. You'll probably see some attention to the tariffs. All of that will have positive economic, I think, opportunities for domestic producers. I think you'll have a much better domestic labor number looking in the first 6 months of the administration. So when you think about international trade, anything that's in manufacturing, anything that's in real estate, anything that's in commercial R&D development and technologies, and I think new technologies and green technologies will be among the things that are focused on the first 6 months of the new administration.
Absolutely. Michael, what can you talk about in respect to sort of taxation and bills that are likely to take effect, on the back of this election and looking forward?
Well, let's talk about the proposed Biden taxes that may affect people going forward. So I think one of the biggest ones is long-term capital gains. So he's proposed that long-term capital gains be taxed at a federal level. Currently, they're taxed at 20% plus another 3.8% for the Affordable Care Act. So total federal tax 23.8. Mr. Biden wants to bring that up to a federal tax of 39.6, so from 20 to 39.6, almost double, 100% increase for people making over $1 million, including the gain itself. This kind of killed two birds at one stone. He was aiming this directly at carried interests for, that's been on the Obama bad naughty list for years, and of course Biden sat next to Obama, and so it's been on Biden's naughty list too. And then it just speaks to I think the Warren Buffett kind of taxation issue that at some millionaire level you should be paying more taxes, not less, and so that would affect, obviously, when people are building companies and they eventually have their exits. It could affect the ultimate tax on the way out. The good news is, by the way, is that there's been no discussion at all, and I don't think there ever will be, on Section 1202 stock, the founder stock. So most entrepreneurs will create businesses. They'll form them as C corporations. And the issue of double taxation really doesn't ever come into play because fledgling companies just don't have earnings that they're paying out at dividends. And so that's kind of white noise. The benefit of doing a C corporation is under the special code section, if you're in the right industry, and most industries are the right industries, and you're a founder, you enter the company when it has less than $50 million of stuff on its balance sheet. You hold it for 5 years and then you sell it. Your long-term capital gain rate can be 0%. Not 20%, 0% on either the first $10 million of gain or 10 times your basis in that stock. So it's a huge, huge benefit, and there's ways to really lever that up and make your wife can hold that stock, your kids can hold that stock, and there's ways to manufacture so you can literally have hundreds of millions of dollars that aren't subject to tax when you eventually sell the company. So that's rock solid. So I think the big fear is, will the capital gains essentially double? But 1202 is there to help all you fresh entrepreneurs. And one other item that I'll mention is that there is a proposal out there that he wants to tax your W-2 income. So right now your W-2 income is subject to Social Security tax on only the first $137,000. What Mr. Biden would do was say, we'll keep that in place, but then people earning from 137 to 400, fine, they don't have to pay any Social Security tax on that, but then we'll start taxing them again above 400,000. And the employers or the employees share that 6.2%. So that's a substantial tax, and you have to think about that if you have 83B stock or you have non-qualified stock options. You're going to exercise.
I'm sorry, we just we've got.
It'll give you wood.
Could everybody mute their phone that isn't speaking? Thank you.
Thank you.
You're gonna have to really watch this capital gain issue. I mean, this Social Security tax issue. And I will say that there is going to be some tax reform. There has to be. We're running deficits that are exceeding our GDP. It's only happened a few times in this country's history. And we are going to eventually have to start paying for this stuff. And when the 2017 Tax Act was passed, it was already revenue negative. They didn't replace it with additional taxes somewhere else in the system or reduced spending. In fact, because of COVID, they've spent trillions of dollars more that they never anticipated spending. So it's sometime that we're going to have to start paying our debts, and it's going to come from taxes.
Right. Yeah, that's really insightful. And I mean, this is do you think we'll ever get back to that pre-COVID economy, and how long do you think it will be until we get there, if we are going to get there?
I'll let the economists weigh in.
Well, we have different views about this. I really think you're supposed to think about this nightmare that we're in has more in common with a natural disaster. The economy was doing fine before we went into this. Then we had to shut down the restaurants and bars and fitness centers to manage the burden. But at the same time, we are pouring resources into compensating people for lost wages. So for that reason, if you look at what's going on here, there's nothing about what's happened this year that looks anything like a business cycle. So all of this is a long story to get to the point. I think that it's reasonable to assume that by the end of this time next year, we'll be very close back to where we were. We've already unemployment has already recovered 70% of the damage from March and April. The national economy has recovered about 85%. A lot of that is because of you close things down and you open them again, and then we gave people a lot of compensation for lost wages, and the consumer is the one that's driving the economy back right now, and I think now we've been hoping the minute you get that vaccine, we can now start to imagine that things might start feeling normal by next summer. That's what Dr. Fauci said. And I think now that we have some really effective vaccines on the way, I think it's not hard to imagine that we'll be out of the woods very shortly. And that, by the way, that tells me, I really think for you guys, moments like this create tremendous opportunity, because there are better ways to do things, and there's a lot of guys that are struggling. And this, I'm referring to the restaurant business, to the hospitality business. There are better ways to do things. And what's really intriguing me is that when you look up at the applications for new business startups, it began to accelerate back in the late spring. And that tells me that people see that when you have disruptions like this, people see opportunity. And I really think that's going to be the story of your world for the next couple of years, because we learn a lot about our system when you get shaken up and you have shocks, and there's a lot of things we can do better. And I think the winners are going to be the guys that are looking around and trying to figure out how do I work with this, because consumers, as long as the demand is there, and it is, because we've really given people paid leave for this crisis, and that's why it feels to me like a New Orleans Hurricane Katrina phenomenon. And that's why I think we'll get out of this faster than you normally would expect with a normal business cycle.
But what about, say, the projected second or third wave through the winter? Isn't that going to slow things down and not bring the economy back to those levels for maybe until the back end of next year even?
Well, I mean, it is a race between getting the vaccine out and then dealing with this. But I think it's interesting that our cases are running 4 to 5 times what they were in the spring, and yet even President-elect Biden is saying we're not talking about a national lockdown. I think we learned, we had to do what we did in March, because the medical system didn't have the ability to handle another wave of patients when the hospitals were full of flu victims. So I think what's going on now is the medical profession has gotten a little better at handling people. The flu season is a little out of the way right now. And a lot of the people who are getting this are college students, are 30 million kids that went back to colleges. So I think it is a big challenge, and it does make people nervous. But I think every day that passes, we're getting closer to the vaccine also. So I think we may have a little bit of a struggle early in the year, but I think by this time next year, this is going to be behind us.
Right.
I think Jim makes an interesting point. This is not a static scenario, because there is a lot of innovation going on in the midst of it. And the entrepreneurism that is going on in the midst of it, in taking advantage of this. If you think about this as a once in a lifetime, ideally, cataclysmic phenomenon, we had the same thing in 2001 with 9/11. We certainly had the same thing with 2008 and the global financial crisis, 2009. The recoveries coming out of those were driven in large part by new technologies, innovation, and creativity. It wasn't just you took a snapshot Polaroid in 2007 and then we looked like that in 2011. We looked very different. And Jim used the D word, the disruption. There's going to be massive disruption coming out of this, and there will be displacement and dislocation, but that will also create new opportunity in unforeseen ways, which is the dynamic of the U.S. economy generally. It's one of the most resilient to be able to absorb a shock like this and come through. And that's not to say that there's not a whole bunch of policy challenges to address the effects of that dislocation. But I think the entrepreneur is going to be driving this recovery. And I agree with him. In 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, you're going to see a very different Polaroid, but a much more stable Polaroid that's more economically sound than we probably feel like we are today.
Right. Got it. And Michael, what sort of strategies do you feel that entrepreneurs should be thinking about during this this phase of coming out of COVID, and as they start up new businesses and the being creative? What strategies do you think that they should be thinking about?
Sure. So I'm a total tax nerd, and so I do a lot of work around income tax, but I also do a lot of work around gift and trust and estates tax. And when you all have when you're starting a company, the enterprise value of that company is always very low or negligible, and it's a great opportunity to peel off some of your units or shares and transfer them into off your balance sheet into trust for example, your children or your heirs. And you could have a grand slam in that you could have transferred something that was worth $5,000 or $6,000, and all of a sudden you have a couple $1 million over in this creditor protected trust for your kids. You don't want to do it after you have your exit and after you've experienced your appreciation, because there's a limit to how much you can transfer using during your lifetime, making lifetime gifts before you're subject to a gift tax. But currently you don't hit that gift tax level until about 11.58 million. By the way, Mr. Biden wants to drop the amount that you can make tax-free gifts during your life to only $1 million from 11.58. So one of the strategies that I've been working with between now and the end of the year is helping people push out money into these trusts so that if the Senate does change hands, they won't be limited to only pushing out $1 million during their lifetime. And so you just have to think. I'm sure everybody here is planning on being successful and turning their ventures into gold. And so it's always good to take a few preparatory steps now while your companies are started, new, but essentially worth very little, and do some planning around those shares. Most people wait until it's too late. They've got a buyer on the hook, and then they'll call me and say, "What do I do? I'm about to be, bought out for $50 or $100 million," and it's really too late. So now's the time to do your tax planning.
Right.
That's actually a great point that Michael brings up, Puja, is the preparatory hygiene for what your economic opportunities look like as a founder, as an entrepreneur, as a business creator. There are things to do, and there are smart things to do from the get-go. And one of the things that we are left with right now in providing actionable advice to our clients is the difficulty of crystal balling with a lava rock, because there are too many unknowns, right? There's an unknown about the outcome of the Senate. There's an unknown about what the decreased majority in the House is going to mean. There's an unknown about the disequilibrium of power, and what does that mean for the power of the centrists with regard to tax policy. And in some ways, it just demonstrates the fool's errand to really try to game the system too much on the outcome of government policy.
Mm-hmm. So
many unknown factors in the negotiation and the sausage making that's on all of our collective horizons that will be DC 2021 and 2022, right? So there are only a certain number of things that you can control. You can control your hygiene, right? As Michael said, you can control your focus on product. You can control your focus on teams. You can control your focus on the rational and the rationale for your ambitions to begin with. If you've got a phenomenal, intellectual property concept or intellectual property portfolio or product line, you focus on that which is knowable, which is developing and focusing on your strategies, focusing on the excellence of your team, focusing on your go-to-market strategy, focusing on the financeability of whatever the opportunities are that are in front of you, regardless of the political noise in the background. And as much as everybody wants to be able to say, oh, this is going to happen, or this isn't going to happen, or maybe this will happen, it's a lot of anticipatory noise to some degree.
Yeah.
But if you're focused on the hygiene, and you're focused on the core principles, and you're focused on the core things that inspired you to do what you're doing to begin with, the outcome almost doesn't matter with regard to the noise in DC. Focus on that which you can control.
Yeah.
Hey, Puja.
Yep.
Could I ask Michael a question about the corporate tax? I thought what we learned over the decades is that the corporate tax rates around the world have generally been coming down because most people work with a territorial tax system, and the U.S. tax code was really getting out of line, corporate tax, with everybody else. And so going way back to the Kennedy administration, the way we leveled the playing field was allow companies who are earning money abroad to defer it. And I thought one of the real purposes, and I thought it had bipartisan support behind the corporate tax cut in 2017, was to realign the U.S. corporate tax code more with everybody else so that we weren't creating these tax inversion distortions and other kinds of things. So does the Biden team, do you think that point of view is shared by the Democratic side? Do you think there's an inclination to reverse the corporate tax? Because it seems like that discussion is lost, is not going on.
So the moderates, so yes, Biden wants to, for everybody on the phone, the corporate tax before the last tax cut, Jobs Act, was 35%, and it was lowered to 21%. And in fact, to not disadvantage partnerships and LLCs, they were actually given a special pass-through deduction to hopefully bring them down also to a 21-ish% income tax. Biden administration would want the corporate tax to go up, not back to 35%, but to 28%. And that was where it was pegged, I think, back in 2009. And I don't know why he has 2009 as a bugaboo, but he's pegging a lot of his tax rules back to 2009.
Got it.
And he also wants to raise the GILTI tax. So if you're a U.S. person and you have an offshore operating business, the tax on those offshore earnings was lowered to 10%. He wants to raise it to 15%. So he's nibbling at the edges of the Tax and Job Cut Act.
Is that your question, Jim?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so we don't have very long to go. We have a couple of questions from the audience. One of which is from Clayton Fenner. And the question is, what are the risks of new local and state taxes given the loss in revenue and increase in expenses due to COVID? Do you think any stimulus will provide relief to locals and states to help offset their pressures? So I guess this is to everybody, and we can start off with Michael.
So I think state and local taxes will be increased. I mean, they have running deficits too from these massive expenditures that nobody anticipated. The upcoming expenses are going to be, they are going to be in charge of distributing the medicine, next year. And that's going to be a major tactical challenge, especially since some of these, I forget which provider, but they have to be kept dry ice, minus 92 degrees, and then, so just storage and transportation is going to be an issue. Logistics, but their unemployment buckets have been depleted. There's some severe challenges, and so I think it's reasonable to anticipate that state and local taxes will go up. Now, I'll tell you, everybody on the phone, part of the Tax Cut and Job Act of 2017 was that that act limits the ability for you to deduct your SALT taxes, state and local taxes, to a maximum of $10,000 a year. There are some strategies, I'll just mention, using non-grantor trusts, where you can multiply that deduction a bit. But just know that when they raise these taxes, it's going to really smart for a while until that Tax Act expires, which will be in 2026.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Puja, I think the next round or two of fiscal support will probably be better targeted to municipalities and and anyone in the air travel system. The real fundamental, there's two problems here. Even before the crisis, state and local communities had a structural problem because they've got unfunded liabilities and some regions are doing better than others. The problem is the COVID crisis. The real hit from the COVID crisis comes from the fact that we're not traveling. The world's not traveling, we're not traveling. And if you're not traveling, communities that depend on tourism are not getting the sales tax collection. So the real hit to state and local finances has come from sales tax collapse. And it's hard to, if we're all going to get back to normal within 6 months, you can get people to fly again. Some of this will come back. So a lot depends on how successful sorry we are in getting lifelines to municipalities just to carry them over this valley. If we can do that, then we're back to sort of struggling with the underlying structural problems that have been plaguing everybody for a long time. And those problems have a lot to do with the demographics of the US. If you're in the Northeast or the upper Midwest, you got a bunch of retiring teachers and firemen and policemen, but your tax base is moving somewhere else. And that's the fundamental, that's not a COVID problem. That's a long-term structural problem. So I think Mike was probably right, but I think we can alleviate some of that pressure if we get a lifeline.
Right.
That can also be one of the most significant outcomes of the Georgia Senate election. If they both go blue, and you've got control of the Senate nominally going to Chuck Schumer, then you've got a much stronger impetus on a stimulus package that looks much more pro-coastal than all of the discussions about the COVID stimulus right now. The one thing that the current administration has been loath to do, and Mitch McConnell has been loath to do, is direct substantial stimulus dollars to the coastal cities for the benefit of the quote-unquote blue-run jurisdictions. And if you end up with a blue Senate, I think that whole obstacle becomes a much, much stronger negotiation point for the administration to be able to assist those cities. But who knows? If the seats stay red, does this standstill continue? Perhaps. It depends on how much of a threat Mitch McConnell feels like his 20 exposed seats are going into the midterms, and whether or not he's got to deliver a coherent stimulus to some of the larger states in which some of his majority sits. So,
right. Sounds very uncertain though, right? So, I mean, having to navigate through these uncertain times is pretty challenging. But one thing that, I don't see any other questions from the audience, but I have a question around, I personally have a question around remote workers. Obviously people are moving out from cities. Offices are not being used, so the taxes are not being collected for people coming in and out of these large cities. I can see it happening on my doorstep in New York. I know it's happening in Chicago, San Francisco. What impact? How are we going to be able to bring people back to the cities? What sort of there's challenges, right? So how are we going to get around that? How are we going to bring people back to the cities
when we no longer are afraid of the virus, right? So that's why I think the vaccine is absolutely critical here, because if by next summer, as the CDC says, we've got most of this distributed, I honestly think we're going to find, yes, there's a lot of great benefit of we can be more efficient communicating this way and working remotely, but we forget there's a lot of benefits of working in the office. And I really think building culture, learning things. When you're young coming out of college, you don't learn what you need to learn very efficiently this way. You and I, we have a rhythm. We know what we're doing, and we don't need to be in the office. But when you're young, there's a lot you learn. And I think it's interesting. We did a survey of our 250,000 employees, and what we found was the younger you are, the more you want to be in the office. Right. So if you give me a reason not to be afraid, I'll be in the office.
I think that's the key issue, is the fear factor. And Puja, you talked about being in New York. From the a situation around the beginning part of July where I could sit down in the middle of Park Avenue with my dog and get a photograph at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and not worry about a car hitting me with a 3-mile radius anywhere around me, to now traffic being gridlock again, and going to the Met a few weeks ago and seeing the Met teeming with people. As the fear cycle ebbs and as control of the virus starts to become more apparent, and as the grip of the social ramifications of the virus become more evident and the fear factor is lowered, I'm not particularly worried about people repopulating the cities. There's in New York, San Francisco, these economic engines, unlike any other on the planet, are going to be just fine. It's, I think, some of the more secondary, tertiary cities that have been impacted, and the stimulus dollars that are going to have to be thought about rationally and invested for the long-term resurrection of these places. That's what's probably on the horizon, and that's what should be keeping policymakers awake. Not necessarily New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, but it's the manufacturing cities, it's the secondary, tertiary cities in the country that have been hardest hit, and that also have the structural issues that Jim talked about with a shrinking tax base and everything else. So the challenges are going to be myriad beyond the next 12 to 18 months.
Absolutely.
A question for my panelists. So our respective companies have massive real estate footprints around the world. And I'm sure we've discovered that we can get away with not visiting those pieces of real estate every day for our jobs. And so I wonder whether corporate balance sheets will be looking to trim, not eliminate, but trim down their office space over the next few years, maybe using more of a condominium type of system, shared offices, like a lot of the big four use. So I know, for example, we have 9 floors in the Atlanta office, and there's one person on the floor a day, and that's it. Nobody else is allowed to go in. They've eliminated our key cards for parking and elevators in our office space. And we've gotten along just fine. And I agree, it's very damaging to the culture, but I mean, from a systemic standpoint, it's fine. So I wonder whether businesses will take the opportunity now to slowly shed some of their real estate.
Absolutely. And I don't want to speak for DLA specifically, but I think you can look at the legal industry generally, and the contraction was already underway. And anybody who was re-upping leases in a material way was usually doing that with a 30% haircut on their footprint and a more rational use of their space because of the changes that are going on in the legal industry and certainly at our clients. But almost every deal that I'm looking at going into 2021 has a real estate component now because people are trying to rationalize their portfolio, and to the degree that they have employees that are more amenable to a co-location or a rotational basis or a hoteling situation. I think any company has got to be more aggressively contemplating that and rationalizing their capex on their real estate footprint. Hence the ticking time bomb on the horizon in commercial real estate.
I mean, this is the one issue that comes up the most in my discussions with Commercial Real Estate Outlook. I'm trying to avoid having an opinion about this right now because I keep asking myself, what would I think if I know there is a vaccine and this whole thing is behind us and we can get back to life? And I think that's why I don't really. It's maybe early. You're probably right in spirit, but I think it's a little early to figure this out yet. And by the way, there's something else going on in the country that affects real estate. Broadly, our population is migrating out, to other areas. Well, if people and the labor force is migrating southeast, south, mountain states, and when people migrate to other areas, the offices don't follow them. You can't move the offices, so you got to rebuild. So I think, that phenomenon is generating offsetting support in the commercial real estate areas. So there's a lot of stuff going on up in Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Texas, Southeast. And I think it's complicated because you're probably right about the impact of COVID, but there's other things going on that have been going on for a while, and they're all sort of positive, I think, for commercial real estate and for the office real estate.
On a regional basis, absolutely. I think you've got real regional opportunities in that migration. And look, New York's always going to be New York. San Francisco is always going to be San Francisco. There's always going to be something to backfill any migratory impact, at least in the short term. So no, I think you're right, and I don't mean to sound cataclysmic. I think it's a bit of a reckoning, and how that reckoning takes place. But look, we get through these reckonings as the dynamic economy that we are, and we get it in creative ways that we probably can't even foretell at the time that we're looking down the horizon and thinking about it hitting us.
Absolutely, and we should be back with a bang by next year, according to Jim. So, chaps, we've come to the end of our panel and our discussion time. We do have to hop to another session, but I'd like to say a massive thank you to all of you. It's been super insightful. I'm already seeing a lot of thumbs up from the audience. I would say closing comments, 30 seconds, closing comments, Tom?
Stay close to your advisors, stay away from the news, stay close to your family, and look forward to doing what you do best as an entrepreneur.
Perfect. Michael?
Just for you, I love that term that you used, preparatory hygiene. I'm going to use that for the rest of my career and not give you any credit. So, but again, that's a way to inoculate your balance sheet against either outcome of elections, and no matter where taxes go, if you can do some upfront planning with your fledgling companies, it can really go a long way to avoiding gift and estate tax, to avoiding capital gains tax, to providing creditor protection once you've built up value in your shares. So it only takes a couple hours really upfront with somebody that knows what they're doing to help set some structure up around your holdings, and then you can forget you ever did it and move on and run your business and create your millions. So please don't ignore some of this preparatory work that you need to do.
Thank you. And Jim?
Yeah, we have to recognize this is a really difficult year. There's a lot of upheaval, but I think we live in an amazing time. And what I mean by that is not just about our own little market. The world is waking up, and it wants to go to work. And there's a lot of upside. And you see that story reflected in the fact that the value of the U.S. stock market is now 1.5 times the size of the U.S. economy. That is not supposed to happen. And that's telling you that there's something going on. It's innovation. It's globalization, which is opening up new markets everywhere. And I think this is why, by the way, for all the chaos that you might have expected from this crisis, isn't it amazing that the equity market is able to sort of look past this? And I think the reason is because they smell something big going on. And that's the world we live in. And this is a great time for people. If you see opportunities, you jump on it. It's going to be really a good ride for the next, for the next couple of decades, I think.
That's great to know. It's super to hear that optimism. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.